This jet did not crash in combat, it crashed in politics. Europe wanted a fighter jet that could prove the continent was ready to defend itself without depending on America. Instead, France and Germany could not agree on who would control it. Now, a €100 billion defence dream has fallen apart at the worst possible moment. Russia is rearming, NATO is under pressure, Washington is asking Europe to carry more of the burden, and Europe's biggest answer just failed its first real test. The project was called FCAS, the Future Combat Air System. It was supposed to be Europe's next-generation air combat program, not just one aircraft, a sixth-generation fighter jet, drones flying beside it, sensors linked across the battlefield, a combat cloud connecting pilots, weapons, commanders, and data. In public, it was presented as European unity, France, Germany, and Spain building the future together, a symbol of strategic autonomy, a message to Washington, a message to Moscow. A message to the world that Europe could build hard power on its own terms. But behind the official language, the project was stuck in a deeper fight. Not over whether Europe needed a new fighter, it did. Not over whether the threat was real, it was. The fight was over control. Who leads the aircraft? Who owns the technology? Who decides how the system is built? Who gets the contracts that shape Europe's air power for the next generation? Those questions broke the project before it reached the runway. On one side was Dassault Aviation, the French company behind the Rafale fighter. For France, Dassault was not just another contractor, it was a national strategic asset. France has its own nuclear deterrent. France operates aircraft carriers. France has its own military doctrine. Paris wanted the future fighter to reflect those needs. So France wanted Dassault to lead the core aircraft. Not symbolically, operationally, technically, strategically. On the other side was Airbus, representing German and Spanish industrial interests. Airbus did not want to become a junior partner inside a program Germany and Spain were helping to finance and build. Germany wanted balance. Spain wanted its share. Airbus wanted real authority. And that is where the European dream began to split. Because this was never only about a plane. It was about who holds power inside Europe's defence future. France wanted leadership. Germany wanted balance. Spain wanted relevance. Industry wanted contracts. And no side wanted to surrender the future. That is why the collapse matters. For years, European leaders have said the continent must become more sovereign in defence. The argument became louder after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It became louder as NATO countries faced pressure to increase defence spending. And it became louder as Donald Trump repeatedly pushed Europe to carry more of its own security burden. The message from Europe was supposed to be clear. Spend more, build more, coordinate more, depend less. FCAS was supposed to be proof that Europe could do it. Instead, it became proof of the problem. Europe had the money, Europe had the engineers, Europe had the threat. What it did not have was trust. That is the real story. A fighter jet can be designed on a screen, a weapon system can be drawn in a blueprint. But a program this large requires governments to share power for decades, and that is where Europe hit the wall. France and Germany are the two central engines of the European Union. When they agree, Europe moves. When they stall, Europe freezes. And on this project, they stalled. French officials wanted Dassault to remain in charge of the fighter jet itself. German and Spanish industry wanted a more equal distribution of work, technology, and authority. Both positions had logic. Together, they made the program almost impossible to move forward. Because the question was not small. It was not about one component, it was about the heart of the system. The aircraft, the cockpit, the software, the intellectual property, the future industrial base. The country that leads this aircraft does not just lead one defence project, it shapes Europe's air power for the 2040s. That is why nobody wanted to lose. And that is why the project broke. But there is another reason this story matters to the record room. Italy was not inside FCAS. Rome had already chosen another path. Italy joined Britain and Japan in the Global Combat Air Programme, known as GCAP, another next-generation fighter project, another attempt to build the aircraft of the future, but with a different political map. Not France and Germany trying to divide control inside the European Union. Italy, Britain and Japan trying to build a fighter through a wider strategic partnership. That choice now looks very different, because while Paris and Berlin fought over control, Rome had already placed its bet somewhere else. And if FCAS is the story of Europe's internal deadlock, GCAP may become the story of Italy's escape route. That is where Giorgia Meloni enters the file. Meloni has spent years trying to position Italy as more than a follower inside Europe, not just the country that reacts to decisions made in Paris, Berlin or Brussels, a country that can choose its own alliances, a country that can sit with Washington, London, Tokyo and Brussels without being trapped by any one of them. GCAP fits that image. It lets Italy say something powerful. Europe may be divided, but Italy is still building. That does not mean GCAP is guaranteed to succeed. Nothing in defence is guaranteed. A next-generation fighter is expensive, complex, and politically fragile. But FCAS has just shown why Italy's alternative path matters. When Europe's most ambitious internal defence project collapses over control, any country that chose a different structure suddenly looks less isolated. It may look ahead of the curve. Now consider how this looks from Washington. Trump has been telling Europe to carry more of the defence burden, not in diplomatic language, in blunt political terms. Pay more, build more, stop expecting America to do everything. European leaders often answer that they are ready. They talk about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, defence integration, industrial capacity. Then the continent's flagship future fighter project collapses because France, Germany, Spain, Dassault and Airbus cannot agree on control. That is not the message Europe wanted to send. Because Washington does not only measure Europe by speeches, it measures Europe by capability. Can Europe build aircraft? Can Europe move fast? Can Europe replace dependence with production? Can Europe turn fear into military power? FCAS was supposed to answer yes. Instead, it answered maybe. And maybe is not enough when Russia is rearming and NATO is being forced to rethink its future. This is the uncomfortable part. Europe says it wants independence from Washington, but independence requires more than ambition. It requires factories, supply chains, weapon systems, political discipline, and trust between governments. FCAS had ambition. It had money. It had engineers. It had political symbolism, but it did not have enough trust. If you're finding this useful, subscribe to the Record Room, because the collapse of FCAS is not just a French-German problem, it is a warning about Europe's entire defence project. The public words are always grand: unity, sovereignty, autonomy, common defence. But the private questions are harder. Who pays? Who leads? Who builds? Who owns? Who commands? Who profits? FCAS reached those questions, and the answers did not align. That is why this collapse sends a message beyond Paris and Berlin. It sends a message to NATO. Europe may spend more, but spending does not automatically produce common capability. It sends a message to Moscow. Europe's political unity can look strong in declarations, but fragile in procurement. It sends a message to Washington. European leaders may want more independence, but they still struggle to build the systems independence requires. And it sends a message to Rome. Italy's decision to build with Britain and Japan is no longer just an industrial choice, it is a strategic contrast. France and Germany tried to build Europe's future fighter inside the old continental engine. Italy chose a different engine. Now one of those engines has failed. That does not make Rome the winner yet. But it does make Italy's choice much more interesting. Because if Europe cannot agree on who controls its own future fighter, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who will actually build the future of European air power? France may go its own way. Germany may look for another structure. Spain must decide what remains worth saving. Airbus and Dassault will defend their interests, and the F-35 will continue sitting in the background as the American alternative that already exists. That is the American shadow in this story. The F-35 is available, it is proven, it is backed by Washington. For countries facing immediate air power needs, that matters. So when Europe's own next-generation fighter struggles, the argument for buying American becomes stronger. Not because every country wants dependence, but because capability gaps do not wait for perfect European consensus. This is the choice Europe keeps facing. Buy what exists and deepen dependence. Go national and fragment Europe further. Or try another multinational European solution and risk the same internal fight again. None of those options is clean. And that is why this story is bigger than one aircraft. It is about whether Europe can build military power together, whether it can turn summit language into production lines, whether it can turn political pressure into real deterrence. For Emmanuel Macron, this is a direct blow. Macron has spent years arguing for a stronger, more sovereign Europe, a Europe that can act when Washington hesitates, a Europe that can defend its own interests. FCAS fit that vision perfectly. A French, German, Spanish flagship, a European fighter for a European future. Now that flagship has become evidence of the weakness Macron has spent years warning against. Europe needs power, but it cannot build power if its biggest members cannot share control. For Friedrich Merz, the pressure is different. Germany is being asked to take a larger defence role, to spend more, to lead more, to become a more serious military actor inside Europe. But leadership also means protecting German industry, and Berlin was not prepared to accept a project where German participation looked unequal. That is the German dilemma. Germany is expected to lead, but it does not want to simply fund another country's vision. Spain faces a quieter but important problem. Madrid joined the project to be inside Europe's future defence architecture. Spanish industry had a stake. Spanish influence was part of the bargain. But if the core fighter collapses, Spain must decide how much value remains in the wider system. Because a combat cloud without the main fighter is a different project. Useful perhaps, but no longer the same symbol. That is the record. France wanted control, Germany wanted balance, Spain wanted its seat. Dassault wanted leadership, Airbus wanted authority, and the project could not hold those demands together. The result is not just a broken defence programme, it is a warning sign at the centre of Europe's security debate. For years, the question was whether Europe would spend enough. Now the harder question is whether Europe can decide fast enough. Because money alone does not build deterrence. Budgets do not fly missions, press conferences do not replace aircraft, and declarations do not create trust between governments. The next era of warfare will demand speed, technology, coordination, and political discipline. Europe says it understands that. FCAS shows how difficult it is to act on it. The fighter never entered service. It never flew over Europe. It never faced an enemy. But it still revealed the central weakness in Europe's defence project. The weakness was not engineering, it was trust. And that is why the story does not end with this collapse. Because the threat environment is not slowing down. Russia is not waiting. NATO's burden-sharing debate is not disappearing. Washington's pressure is not going away. And Europe's need for credible defence is only growing. The aircraft may be grounded, but the question behind it is still moving. Can Europe build military power together? Or will the next crisis expose the same problem again? Not money, not technology, not ambition, control. Subscribe to the Record Room because the next file is already open. Word count 1681.